Welcome to our World Heritage 2021 debate. 2021 debate is a year of events focused on protection, conservation, and management of World Heritage. We want to uncover untold stories to broaden our views on heritage practices and future perspectives. Knowledge gathered this year will be published in 2022 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Convention. The Our World Heritage Initiative is created by individuals working on 100% voluntary capacity. We would like to point out that Our World Heritage provides an open dialogue platform that is based on voluntary work of session organizers and speakers. Our World Heritage welcomes diverse viewpoints in the spirit of collegial debate where mutual respect is afforded to all. Please note that the expressed views do not necessarily reflect the official position of Our World Heritage. We thank today's speakers for telling their stories, and we thank you, the listeners, for your kind interest and questions. If you want to remain up to date on our activities, you can follow our social media. We maintain channels in multiple languages to break through the language barriers and connect to local communities. You will find all links on our website, ourworldheritage.org. Thank you for being with us today, and we wish you a very fruitful event. Welcome to our World Heritage 2021 debate. 2021 debate is a year of events focused on protection, conservation, and management of World Heritage. We want to uncover untold stories to broaden our views on heritage practices and future perspectives. Knowledge gathered this year will be published in 2022 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Convention. The Our World Heritage Initiative is created by individuals working on 100% voluntary capacity. We would like to point out that Our World Heritage provides an open dialogue platform that is based on voluntary work of session organizers and speakers. Our World Heritage welcomes diverse viewpoints in the spirit of collegial debate where mutual respect is afforded to all. Please note that the expressed views do not necessarily reflect the official position of Our World Heritage. We thank today's speakers for telling their stories, and we thank you, the listeners, for your kind interest and questions. If you want to remain up to date on our activities, you can follow our social media. We maintain channels in multiple languages to break through the language barriers and connect to local communities. You will find all links on our website, ourworldheritage.org. Thank you for being with us today, and we wish you a very fruitful event. Welcome to our World Heritage 2021 debate. 2021 debate is a year of events focused on protection, conservation, and management of World Heritage. We want to uncover untold stories to broaden our views on heritage practices and future perspectives. Knowledge gathered this year will be published in 2022 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Convention. The Our World Heritage Initiative is created by individuals working on 100% voluntary capacity. We would like to point out that Our World Heritage provides an open dialogue platform that is based on voluntary work of session organizers and speakers. Our World Heritage welcomes diverse viewpoints in the spirit of collegial debate where mutual respect is afforded to all. Please note that the expressed views do not necessarily reflect the official position of our World Heritage. We thank today's speakers for telling their stories, and we thank you, the listeners, for your kind interest and questions. If you want to remain up to date on our activities, you can follow our social media. We maintain channels in multiple languages to break through the language barriers and connect to local communities. You will find all links on
new governance and decision-making processes. This session will reflect on the contribution of heritage economics to this challenging perspective. At the beginning of the 1980s, the conservation field grew very fast, boosted by the adoption of multiple conventions, charters, guidelines, and recommendations, which paved the way for modern conservation as we know it today. At the time, heritage economics was only considered as a support, mainly through cultural tourism. Sometimes it was called a constraint to conservation, confusing two aspects, financial costs and sound allocation of economic resources. It was considered as a bonus to cultural policies rather than part of them. Today, heritage economics is better accepted as one of the four pillars of sustainable conservation, with a rich literature full of innovative conceptual and methodological reflections and tools. The session will rely on such scientific contributions, but also on how heritage economics affects decision making and responsibility for achieving the right balance between conflicting stakes that may arise in the conservation field. New approaches include measures to foster sharing knowledge between disciplines at every step of the conservation process, so documenting, planning, restoring, monitoring, and ways to share innovative models in terms of governance, partnership, financing, and decision making. For those of you who just join us now, I would like to welcome you and to introduce our today's presenters. First of all, I would like to welcome Professor Dr. David Strossby, who is a distinguished professor of economics at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. He's internationally recognized for his research and writing on the economics of art and culture. He has been carrying out research in heritage economics for more than 30 years and has written many papers, books, and reports in this field. David, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruba. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I look forward to talking to you all. I hope you can see my slides there. Let me see. Hang on. Yes, share screen. There we are. And okay. I have a rather difficult task, which is to review the whole of heritage economics over the last 40 years in 15 minutes, which is not really a very easy task because there's been a great deal happening in that time. As Ruben just said, heritage economics has certainly been around for longer than 40 years. And in fact, if you look at any statement about cultural policy in many countries ever since the 1960s, you'll see heritage is one of the ones, protection of heritage is one of the main arms of cultural policy. And there's always been a sort of sense in which economics has been part of that, if only because heritage, preserving heritage and conserving heritage cost money. And so there was always at least a sort of sense in which the finances were relevant and needed to be taken account of. But I think it's generally true to say that the origins of heritage economics as a sort of formal field in economics, or at least as a sort of sub-sector of cultural economics, which has also grown up in that same period, it probably began in the early 1990s with a lecture that Alan Peacock, a British economist who died several years ago, but was a major contributor to the field. He gave a lecture at the British Association in 1994, which was entitled, "Does the Past Have a Future?" And in it, he raised some quite serious questions about whether or not public preferences should be taken into account in decision-making in heritage matters. He made the observation that most decisions in relation to conservation were made by heritage professionals, and they really used only their own criteria in making the decisions, and that there should be some economic criteria included in the decision-making process. That caused quite a lot of concern amongst the heritage profession in that time, but it really did start economists, I think, thinking seriously about what heritage was, how the tools of economic theory, economic analysis could be applied to consideration of heritage matters. And so that's where it all began. In this very short period, I'm just going to pick out sort of three areas which are probably some of the main areas which have been looked at by economists in looking at heritage over this period. First of all, theory. Secondly, the question of value is always there. Value and valuation is one of the most fundamental questions that has to be faced up to. And then finally, some observations about policy. So let me start first of all in relation to theory. When economists start to look at an area like this, the first obligation, as it were, is to think, how are we going to interpret this as a cultural good, or as a good or a service which is to be analyzed using the tools of economic analysis. And so that meant a cultural good, and a cultural good is at that time, in the early 1990s, was beginning to be recognized as a good which was separate from other commodities in the economy, and that the distinguishing feature of these was a certain symbolic content, cultural content, which could be divorced from the economic content. And that led in 1999 to the formalization of that proposition in the concept of cultural capital. And this was seen as being something which was not unlike natural capital, which are capital assets from natural resources. Cultural resources could also be seen as capital assets. And so the introduction into economics formally, as it were, in 1999 of the concept of cultural capital meant that it was possible to apply the tools of investment analysis and capital appraisal analysis, which were very common in economics in relation to capital projects in general, if you're building airports or roads or whatever, hospitals or schools. In the case of cultural conservation, this could be seen as a capital project, and so the tools of economic analysis could be applied to that. And so that was really where it began. But as I said, the links with natural capital and with environmental economics were immediately recognized. And this was important for a variety of reasons. First of all, it was important because a lot of methodologies were being developed in environmental economics for looking at questions of value, and these were almost immediately transferable into thinking about valuation of cultural assets. And so that was one thing. And the other thing I think which is also important about this link, which has been developed much further since then, has been the link with sustainability and sustainable development, because the thinking about natural capital had at that stage had progressed quite a lot since the Brundtland Report of 1987. You might remember the report, which was called Our Common Future, was about natural capital and sustainable, introduced the concept of sustainable development, and that was easily transferable, readily transferable to thinking about cultural capital in the same terms as natural capital. So those were some of the basic theories, and of course one of the major components of that was the question of value. And that's the second thing that I want to talk about. Now, I think that in relation to cultural goods generally, and certainly in relation to heritage, we can see that there is a fairly clear distinction, and I think it's generally agreed, certainly amongst economists who work in this field, as a distinction between what we call economic value and cultural value. The difference being that economic value is measured in monetary terms. Cultural value doesn't have any such measure and can't really be measured in monetary terms. And this is something which has remained sort of constant in the field of cultural economics since, and certainly in relation to thinking about the valuation of heritage. I think that the idea of a duality of value in relation to cultural phenomena was not only true in economics, but we had a workshop in Bellagio in Italy that I organized with Michael Hutter, my colleague Michael Hutter, on the notion of economic and cultural value much more broadly in areas like art history, anthropology, sociology, and so on. And always when we're talking about cultural goods, this notion of the duality of value came out. So we have this question of, let's look at, first of all, in relation to economic value. There was a lot of interest, or there has been a lot of interest, mostly on non-market value. We make the distinction between use value and non-use value. And in the case of non-use value, or we call it non-market value, we have two ways of assessing this: revealed preference methods, which is the ways of looking at what people actually do, and some applications here, particularly to looking at the contribution of heritage to the value of real estate. That's been done, but most of it has been in relation to stated preference methods, which is contingent valuation, and more recently discrete choice modeling, and now also benefit transfer studies. So these are techniques which are being used, and there's been a huge outpouring of such studies, and these have been published in mostly, or quite a lot of them have been published in the Journal of Cultural Economics. In fact, it got to the point at one stage where the Journal of Cultural Economics had to say, no more contingent valuation studies. We've got too many already for heritage sites and buildings and so on. But that continues to go on, and the methodologies keep being refined. In relation to cultural value, the conceptual basis is well established. We know that it can be disaggregated into component parts, and we know that there are ways in which we can measure these using methods like rating and ranking and so on, but there's still a long way to go, and we need a proper sort of metric for doing this. Finally, let me say something about policy, and I divide this up into two parts. First of all, micro policy, meaning the management of sites and museums and galleries and so on. In other words, the sort of micro level policy decisions that have to be made by managers as to how to operate. And here there's been a very considerable development, particularly in developing new business models in changing circumstances as to how these function as economic entities. And Christian Ost is going to be talking, I think, in this panel about some new business models. But one of the things that is most striking, I think, about the micro level policy making and the influence of things on the operations of museums and sites and galleries has been digital technologies. This is something which has been going on for many years, but it has been accelerated very much by the pandemic because when the in-person visitors to museums or sites and tourists and so on all dropped off with the pandemic, there has been a huge rise in the use of digital technologies to spread the messages, the work of these institutions to a wider public, and that's going to continue. I don't think there's much doubt that this is that this has been accelerated considerably during the pandemic. And so I suppose if you could say if there's any sort of benefit that's come from the pandemic, that's one of them that has accelerated this sort of work. At the macro level, there's continuing sort of interest in things like how do the instruments of economic policy work for heritage. As we know, for heritage, it's mostly the mostly regulatory instruments like listing and such as listing and so on. But the issues of private versus public interest, since heritage is both a private and a public asset, and generates both private values and public values, then the sort of balance, if you like, in policy to serve those two interests has been something which has been of considerable interest and ongoing attention by economists. And then finally, there's the question of finance. Here we are again with heritage as a public good, and one of the rationales for intervention into this industry or this area is the fact that the public interest can be protected through public expenditure. And the ways for doing this and the means for raising the finance are areas where public finance people are particularly concerned and interested because there's pressure on government funds and so on, as we know. There's an interesting project going on at the moment, and I could just mention this. In the UK, there's a project on cultural and heritage capital. It's picked up on the cultural capital concept and is looking at the ways in which the services provided by this capital can be valued in a way which is consistent with the Treasury's procedures. In the UK, it's called the Green Book. Most countries have a set of procedures for public expenditure, public investments, and project appraisal, and so on. And this project, which is being undertaken by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport in the UK, is underway at the moment and well worth having a look at as an example of the ways in which the theory of cultural capital can be put into practice in looking at actual policy decisions. Well, I think I've run out of my 15 minutes, so I'll leave it to my other colleagues on the panel to, I've been looking mostly at the past. It'll be up to them to look towards the future, which I'm sure they will do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for this insightful presentation. And actually, you haven't used all your 15 minutes. You finished right before time. So thank you very much for this, but we will have the opportunity to discuss with the panelists, but also with the participants, with the audience in a while. I actually couldn't present you properly because I had a technical issue. So now I can very quickly just explain that we're having 4 speakers today, and then we're opening the discussion. So if you have questions, please type them in the chat box. I'm going to present now our second speaker, who is Professor Dr. Christian Ost. He is the president of the Raymond Lemaire International Center for Conservation at the University of KU Leuven and honorary rector of ISHEC Brussels Management School. His research topics and expertise are on business cycle theory and heritage economics. He is a guest lecturer at KU Leuven, UC Leuven, and Burgundy School of Business in Dijon. He has been developing the field of economics applied to cultural heritage since the 1980s and collaborated with many universities and cultural organizations around the world, such as ICROM, UNESCO, the Getty Conservation Institute, the Global Heritage Fund, and ICOMOS. Christian, I stop my presentation and the floor is yours.
Okay. I don't know if you see this my screen, not yet?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Yes, okay. Yeah. Like this is fine. Can you hear me? Okay. So thank you very much, first Monica, for inviting us to make this session. Thank you, Ruba, because I know that you did a lot to organize these 2 sessions. Next one will be next week, as you know. And thank you also. This is a pleasure, you see, to speak right after David, because he's still our flagship in the community of cultural economists. So I always enjoy listening to David, and what I would try to do is exactly what he said, is try to extend maybe to the future, or to what we need to expect as new approaches or new tools, considering economics and management, especially, that could be helpful for conservation. And so I will speak about, after a while, about value chain and innovative business model, and some other topic that we are now investigating in our field. Maybe just to remind something that everybody knows, but that we have today a need for new approaches in heritage conservation, and especially because these are this framework that has been mentioned by David, about this 4-pillar sustainability paradigm. Of course, all the global report made by UNESCO, the Sustainable Development Goals, and also the last item there about the green report made by Europa Nostra and the European Bank of Investment for the European Union, which is a very important, maybe landmark also. As explained, and this maybe sounds a bit provocative, but it implies that conservation in some way, and at some times, I'm not speaking about the outstanding value, maybe monuments, but it's difficult and it's harder maybe to legitimize itself just by cultural values. And this is about what we did in cultural economics, to see this duality, as David explained, about cultural values and economic values. There is no in conflict. They can go hand to hand. And so that we probably, in a framework of sustainability, we need to have different approaches that integrate better the cultural policies and the economic and social policies, environmental issues, and so on. And this is, I will take one perspective of that, one about the innovation and the creativity, especially cultural creative industries these days, that can maybe bring this connection between what we expect here. So in other words, the question here is which innovative and creative new approach for the World Heritage, looking at heritage conservation as cultural and creative industry. As you know, this is the right time because 2021 is the year of creativity, about international year. And what I would like to do is to take one perspective that I very liked is about the long waves and the economic movement and the economic history about Schumpeter. You know, if just in a nutshell, gave to innovation a really important rule. You know, the economic world is not something going in a linear way, but you get ups and downs, you get cycles, you get movement, and you get transition period where it's very important to be in connection with everything that it's destroyed because of the past and new innovative technologies and production that arise. And of course, the question of cultural heritage is very important in that, because what does that mean, creation, destruction in terms of the heritage? Because we try to protect and the heritage for maybe not for eternity, but for a long period of time. So this is just the framework. I'm not going to go back to these major innovation and the way that Schumpeter made these different waves, but we see that conservation is rather a recent, in the modern conservation, a recent recent issues in this long time frame. We get basically these two waves of innovation. The fourth one, which was a post-reconstruction period after World War II, especially in Europe, and which was, of course, one of the reasons why we try to protect and defend and create UNESCO and everything that you know. Aviation, for example, just to take one example, is something that, of course, allowed a lot of people for cultural tourism and to develop some of these demand side from cultural economics. Then we see that sustainability, but also all the new technologies and the digital innovations were more about, you know, the last 20, 30 years. And that there's a reason there. There is not a coincidence to me that the economic evolution there in terms of sustainability, limits of growth, our common future that was just mentioned, and the SDGs came on the right, I mean, a right time frame in order to bring new innovation or new improvement in terms of heritage conservation. To take another example, to me, the intangible heritage and the fact that we go more for participatory approach with intangible heritage that corresponds better in some part of the world, that the European system based on the tangible heritage is something that goes along with globalization, which goes along with what the economic world globally is living. And then the question is here to remain short in what my explanation, this question about the sixth wave based on sustainability, certainly a green economy, and then a lot of technologies that we don't know maybe yet, but that could help, of course, the documenting and everything more also technical, but also maybe the 3D or the virtual thing that in a post-COVID time could be useful too. And I just would like to give some example about these implications about how does our World Heritage either benefit from this wave of innovation or may contribute to it through different example. I would suggest to take some example in conservation practices and some example in management and economic tools. In terms of conservation, of course, the aim is to bring this green, sustainable, circular heritage that is based mostly with local outcomes and to bring sustainable tourism, sustainable to prevent gentrification, and to have so sustainable real estate development in historic cities. This is, of course, something that we know already. It would be important to have a better integration of heritage and sustainability, taking the four pillars that we know about this paradigm and the Hangzhou Declaration by UNESCO. And this is something that it's a suggestion or a proposal since a few years to say that when UNESCO designate, you see, or monitor or ask for a management plan to cities being on the list of the World Heritage List, is there not a reason there to bring some additional criteria to the cultural values in terms of economic, social, and environmental implications? Number three, we could speak about a UNESCO which changes also in its nature, becoming global, remaining, of course, global, which is important. There is this world list, but also having maybe some more flexibility, I would say, from in different parts of the world, where the issues are not exactly the same than in the Western world. And this is a bit, I think, what we expect from this HGUL approach, which is a very important recommendation, I guess, in UNESCO that provide us already some tools for that. And last but not least, in terms of policies, there could be somewhere, somehow, a trade-off to be made between conservation and economic development, which would not be easy to do, but at least we need to raise the question and to raise this discussion. The fact that maybe not everything can be conserved the way that we want or the way that we did in the past, and that we have this trade-off, which is very difficult, but we need probably to have discussion about that also. People are not in silos, working on conservation in the conservation field, and at the same time, economists working about their issues. In terms of economic and management tools, I would like to just to mention the three examples of tools that we are experiencing and investigating. The first one is to address a chain value of conservation. This could be very useful to identify where and when the heritage contributes to added value. Just to give you an example of that, you will not going to have time to read all of this, but this is a publication that is forthcoming by Ruba and I, where what we do basically is to see how in conservation and for the cultural built heritage and the intangible, how we could select and identify all the different sectors where there is added value, where there is a potential somewhere to bring, you see, some business, management, economic tools. So this chain value, and of course, all the demand side part of it, which is very important, which is huge in terms of course, the different types of demanders and consumers of heritage, could be addressed with these kind of tools of chain value. Another thing is about business model, innovative business model. We are able now to work with business model which is not profit oriented, but the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and other organizations have developed in the recent past some very adapted business canvas to environmental issues. And the flourishing business canvas is just one example that we have started to test in the European CLIC European project for the European Commission. And it's basically to see where is the added value. You see, in conservation, the first answer is to say, well, the added value is to keep the cultural values, which is true, but there is something else. There is also a duality there, and you can have some added value in terms of really co-creation in circular economy system and so on, to ask how can we do that, how to manage the resources, and who are really the stakeholders. And of course, the outcomes should not be profit, should not be profitable. It should be, of course, social impact and environmental impact. And the very last thing to conclude is that we also experience now, and we try to work on the new training in terms of cultural entrepreneurship and heritage entrepreneurship. And that brings me back to Schumpeter, because Schumpeter was not just, I would say, the first one to speak about innovation, but he spoke also about entrepreneurs. Innovation were brought along by entrepreneurs. So it's important to understand that it's not a question just about arts management or cultural management, accounting techniques and so on, is neither capacity building about conservation. I would say that it's a state of mind. It's the fact to bring artistic or cultural products and service into the market. And of course, to make it feasible or viable. Viable doesn't mean that you make profit. Viable means that there is some way to make it sometimes self-sufficient and to identify exactly the weakness and the strengths of this. So this is something that it's in progress, that we feel that there is a need for the artistic and cultural world to provide this state of mind, not entrepreneurs like Henry Ford or Andrew Carnegie. This is for the past, but maybe think about Steve Jobs, for example. Steve Jobs was not an inventor. He was someone capable, to bring the thing that through the technological innovation, to bring them in the market and to change the behavior of people towards it, which is something that sometimes we say we need to do in terms of culture oriented to have a new types of consumers or new types of consuming about culture. So these are just examples, but of course we will be able maybe to come back on that in the discussion time. Thank you for your attention. Ruba.
Thank you very much, Christian, for your presentation. I think you provided a lot of food for thought. And just to remind the audience, if you're interested in what Christian was presented, one paper about the value chain will be published soon at the special issue of City, Culture and Society, and another one about cultural entrepreneurship will be published at the Journal of Built Heritage. I would like now to introduce our third speaker. So I will share my screen again. And I would like also to welcome Luigi Sacco. He had a very important previous engagement. So welcome Luigi to the session. Shall we proceed with you, or do you prefer Andy to go ahead?
No, at this point, if I was in time, I can also proceed if you want.
Okay.
I'll try to share my screen with the presentation. Let me, or if you have it already, Ruba, do you want to upload it yourself?
Yes, I can share it.
Thank you.
I just wanted to also, I know everyone knows you, but I would like also to present you. So maybe for our audience on YouTube, I will just share just 1 second. Today, technology is not assisting us. Okay. So again, I would like to welcome Professor Dr. Pierre Luigi Sacco. He is a senior advisor at OECD Paris, and actually this is why he just joined us. He was in a meeting just now. He's a professor of cultural economics at EULM University Milan and senior researcher at Meta Lab at Harvard. He has been the special advisor for culture at the European Commission between 2017 and 2019. And he works and consults internationally in the fields of cultural-led development and is author of more than 200 papers on peer-reviewed journals and major international scientific publishers. So Pierre Luigi, I will share your presentation now.
Thank you very much. So in the time that I have, I would like to briefly discuss how we can think of heritage. And this particular paper, by the way, is related to a submission that is gonna be related to the special issue by the Built Heritage Journal about the new definitions of heritage. And in this particular presentation, I am discussing with you what could be the different notions of heritage and a different possible taxonomy of functionings, so to speak, social and cognitive functionings of heritage, keeping into account the relationship of heritage with different regimes of culture and creative production. I have been developing in the last decade this conceptual approach called Synthetically Culture 3.0 that basically spans the differences between cultural production regimes and tries to understand how these differences influence many aspects that we consider critical in the functioning and governance of cultural production systems. So we can go to the next slide. There are basically three different regimes in culture and creative production that are basically patronage, culture and creative industries, and what we could call open platforms and communities of practice. This third regime, of course, has more precarious identification for the simple reason that we are just witnessing the beginning of the regime. So we don't have a very clear idea of how it really works. We are mostly in the situation where we were at the beginning of the 20th century with culture and creative industry, in which, of course, most of the implications of the new industries were unknown in terms also of how they would have affected our own idea of cultural experience formats or meanings. So having this in mind, these regimes are characterized by a few specific elements. In the patronage regime, we can fix some key points in the highbrow versus lowbrow distinction. That is a consequence of the fact that in this regime, quality of experience is dictated by the viewpoint of the experts. Culture as a form of spiritual cultivation, so an aesthetic mode that we could call elevation, where really we are put in the position to, in some sense, to
working in one of these
Pierluigi?
Yes.
Yes.
I think that there was some problem with his microphone. I will
sorry.
ask.
Do you hear me now?
Yes,
Do you hear
yes.
me now?
Yes, now we can hear you. Yes.
So you didn't hear anything so far?
No, we hear. But
yeah.
the last
Okay.
I think 1 minute.
Okay. So just to resume then, the third regime, it's a regime in which we see some emerging characteristics, which are the blurred distinction between producers and users. And of course, we tend to connect this regime as the previous ones to specific technological innovations. But to be fair, I mean, this regime dates back at least in its early stages to the post-Second World War period, in which we witnessed in the post-scarcity society that emerged after the Second World War, the flourishing of subculture, so that the social innovation of subculture precedes the technological innovation of the digital that we see today as the leading force of this new regime. So it's very important to understand that there is a cultural and social dynamics happening before the actual technological revolution. And then, of course, these new forms of culture as collective sense-making, the network organization that is also leading to what we could call a new aesthetics of connection, in which what is really aesthetically accomplishing is not simply the fact that you conform to the standards of and the criteria of the experts, or to the fact that you are able to engage or to sell a lot on specific markets, but the fact that you are going to create meaningful social relationships among people, and that this mobilizes new forms of especially co-created production of content. Okay, over to the next slide. So the point is, how does this translate when we try to understand how the notions of heritage have evolved in parallel to this emergence of different cultural production regimes? So in the heritage 1.0 notion that naturally conforms to the patronage regime is the notion of heritage that's focusing on conservation. The idea is, of course, a very strong emphasis on physical heritage, of course, extended to intangible heritage, but with a very strong focus on preservation, and the idea that basically heritage is for connoisseurs. So the fact that you have, for example, uncultivated visitors in art cities is a necessary evil, so to speak, but it's not something that is really contributing in any meaningful sense. It's basically a threat to the preservation of heritage. It's something that it's necessary for other reasons, but it's not something that is in some sense inscribed into the logic of this particular production regime as far as heritage is concerned. Ideally, in this regime, if we could simply take the heritage under a glass surface and keep it protected from any kind of external threat, that would be the idea. Then you have, of course, the corresponding notion in Heritage 2.0, the corresponding to culture creative industry, that is heritage as an entertainment machine. Think of Venice, and I have explained it with one word, which means really transforming heritage cities into, let's say, places that become, of course, extremely attractive from the point of view of paying customers, and extremely rewarding from the point of view of local businesses, but in which issues of conservation and preservation, of course, have a relatively little importance, but also issues of sense making have relatively little importance, because insofar as there are paying tourists that want to do everybody the same experience, completely standardized, completely stereotyped, that's perfect insofar as they pay. And that's what's been threatening so deeply the future sustainability of many heritage cities in the pre-pandemic phase. But for example, the return of the cruise ships to Venice just a few days ago seems to show that this kind of model is still very resistant also in the post-pandemic scenario. And then, of course, we have the new notions of heritage related to the third regime in terms of community sense making, because if everybody is involved in the production of content, this means that everybody is also involved in the conservation and transmission of content. So as we will see, in some sense, this is very much aligned, by the way, with the new notion of the Faro Convention in terms of heritage communities. So that's basically the translation, the natural translation of the heritage community notion of the Faro Convention. So the idea that there is really a collective responsibility in curating and transmitting heritage. And as we will see, this is also a natural consequence of the functioning of the new regime. Yes, over to the next slide. Yeah. This new regime is basically changing. This is basically changing many different aspects of how we understand heritage in terms of connotation, in terms of production, in terms of how we experience this heritage, how we preserve it, and how we transmit it. So I will be very briefly reviewing some of these points. Yes, over to the next slide. So first of all, we are speaking about participation and the fact that this new notion of heritage is very much about participation. But what do we really mean with participation? And the point is how people are really enabled to participate. We have lots of optimism about the possibilities of this new regime. For example, the fact, as I said, that there is a blurring of production and consumption of content. But how this is happening in practice. Preliminary results that we have, for example, I am at the moment leading a new project on, the digital access to cultural participation, a European Horizon project called Indices. And we have, for example, made some preliminary assessments in terms of how democratic is the access to digital platforms like Wikipedia and TikTok. So on Wikipedia, we find that more or less 20% of the users are actually active users, and of course 80% are more or less. And of course, the really, really active users are a tiny minority of this 20%. So this is not particularly surprising because in the end, Wikipedia is an online encyclopedia and that's very demanding. But what about TikTok? You expect that on TikTok, you have a much more democratic form of access. The answer is no, it's more or less the same. So what is really interesting from this point of view is that although we have a massive new capacity for actual participation, and certainly in the long term, this potential will be actually deployed, the point is that we are still at the very, very early phase of the curve and much is still to be done. So from this point of view, the participation dimension that is related to heritage today is to some extent still a wishful thinking. It's something that certainly will be part of the picture in the future, but it's still in the early phase. Yes, over to the next slide. And of course, there is an adverse selection effect in this participatory governance, for example, of heritage, and it's the fact that the most entitled people are the ones who participate more actively. So the more you are marginalized, the more you feel threatened, for example, in terms of your social identity or for example, your ethnic identity, the least you are invited to, or you feel you are invited to participate. So generally, if you take a let's say a no-brainer approach to participation, simply inviting people to participate, you generally obtain an adverse selection effect. You will have the most entitled people will make their voice heard and all the others will not. This, of course, is a particularly delicate issue today because there is a huge rhetoric of inviting participation, but very little insight on the actual effects of participatory processes. Over to the next slide. Which voices are to be heard? I think that the worst possible damage from this point of view has been made by concept like creative class. So the idea that there is a specific social body that is entitled, in some sense, that's the continuation of the patronage regime through other means in a culture and creative industry source, so to speak. The idea that there are specialist people who are especially endowed to be creative, and those people are in some sense carrying the burden of the progress of society to creativity. What we are seeing is exactly the opposite. We are creating a situation in which everybody has the possibility to contribute. So this kind of dual conceptualization of a creative versus a non-creative class is the most backfiring and the most misleading kind of conceptualization of the current process we could imagine. So what we have to do is exactly the contrary, to dismantle the idea that today it's a matter of creative class taking over in some sense the cultural development, and this of course also matters from the heritage point of view, and it's exactly how we enable a truly inclusive and a truly comprehensive participation of every possible social subject to this new cultural and creative ecosystems. Over to the next slide. So it's the other way around. There is not a matter of class, it's really a matter of, as I said, wide scope participation. Over to the next slide. So how can we, the last point is that the participatory governance of heritage is also about conflict. As we have everybody participating, clearly we have conflicting views, and especially as far as heritage is concerned, that's a really crucial issue. And conflict management from this point of view, we're finding cooperative ways to manage conflict in terms of the, let's say, identity politics of heritage is one of the really crucial issues. And this is where I think the real test from the point of view of the social sustainability of these new distributed models of heritage production and conservation and transmission really lies. And that's a big challenge, not only for Europe, clearly, it's a challenge globally. Okay, over to the next slide. So can we imagine from this point of view, as I said, that we have changes in connotation, production, experience, conservation, and transmission of heritage regarding, of course, the emergence of the new regime. And these changes materialize on different levels. They can materialize at the cognitive level, at the social level, or at the cultural level. And different functionings, in some sense, tell us what's changing from the point of view of the crisscrossing of these various dimensions. So, for example, what changes when we consider changes in the connotation of the experience of heritage from a social point of view, or of the connotation of heritage from the cognitive point of view, and so on. So in the few minutes that are left, I will simply exemplify some of these possibilities. Over. Think, for example, in terms of mapping. what's happening is that heritage grows in dimension from this point of view, because think of the production of images. What you see here is, for example, a mapping from a few years ago in terms of the actual production of images posted on Flickr. And Flickr, it's a very conservative estimate from this point of view if you think of Instagram today. So what's happening is that we are witnessing a dynamics in which every year, basically, we post online more images that have been produced in the whole history of photography before the year we are in. And this pattern is accelerating. So from this point of view, of course, it's extremely important to understand and to map how actually this cultural production happens. And from this point of view, this means that AI-based techniques are indispensable simply to map what heritage is from this point of view. Also because, as we will see, this means that this enormous volume of content production changes completely even the notion of deciding what could be potentially relevant as heritage or what could not. So simply mapping what's happening from this point of view goes completely beyond the traditional scope of expertise that was at the center of traditional notions of heritage. And this really requires sophisticated and distributed approaches that make use, for example, of artificial intelligence. Over. Or for the point of view of filtering, clearly in a situation in which massive amounts of content are produced, which content is relevant? From this point of view, clearly there are people who have a strong social power of pointing attention towards certain types of content rather than other types of content. And digital influencing clearly is part of this. But this also means that for the conservation of heritage, for example, filtering becomes essential. Just to make an example, a brilliant colleague of mine, Sheena Pietro-Bruno, she's a professor in Canada, is working, for example, on the role of YouTube in preserving intangible heritage, orally transmitted heritage in Canadian First Nations. And YouTube has been fundamental in this regard in terms of becoming a repository of content. This repository of content physically guarantees that something is there. But for example, the fact that today, thanks to YouTube, you can also imagine, for example, a heritage-oriented influencing by directing a certain type of attention and traffic towards this type of YouTube content, it's something that would have been unprecedented before, and it's integrally part of conservation. So we have conservation strategies that have to do with YouTube, just to give you the idea of the kind of mental short circuits that are created in the new environment. Over. Then we have a problem of indexing, because of course, it's not simply a problem of mapping, it's not simply a problem of pointing attention, it's the problem of navigating. And navigating really means, of course, metadata. So in some sense, the heritage of the future is very much about metadata. It's very much about creating the maps that allow us to locate specifically heritage and reach specifically heritage through certain navigation strategies. And today we don't have absolutely the tools for a meaningful indexation of content from this point of view. That's a really huge challenge for future research and practice. Over. And then we have problems that have to do, and I provocatively call this metabolizing. This has to do, for example, understanding what could be the social behavioral consequences of heritage. This is, for example, a graph from an experiment that we published a few years ago that has to do with a visit to a real heritage site in which visitors were measured in terms of their rates of salivary cortisol before and after the experience, and they were measured by their level of psychological well-being before and after the experience. And for example, we see today that there are also very important metabolic reactions to, let's say, experiences of heritage. For example, the rates of salivary cortisol of most people after the experience dropped much more than, let's say, predicted by the simple circadian dynamics of the rates of cortisol, which means that, for example, we have to consider the fact that this pervasive presence of heritage is influencing our human functioning in ways that are much more complex than we suspected before. So even a simple visit can have such an important, for example, biological imprint. What can happen when we are today immersing ourselves in content ecosystems in which the dimension of heritage is basically pervading our everyday experience? Okay, over. And then entitlement, of course, so who should defend from this point of view? What we see here, of course, are unfortunately the destruction that was caused, of course, by the notorious tragic events that led not only, of course, to the the death of so many people, but also to the destruction of very, very important assets of heritage of Iraq and the other countries affected, of course, by the new forms of integralistic terrorism. And in this particular case, the point is who's entitled from this point of view to preserve this heritage, to defend it, and in some sense to stand for this kind of heritage. This has very much to do with intrinsic motivation. For example, the new area of public archaeology from this point of view is extremely important because it's not simply considering archaeological missions as missions that have to do with knowledge and excavation, but have to do, for example, with building social capital with existing populations, and so that it's possible to create social conditions for the preservation of the physical transmission of heritage. And again, this has not only to do with physical experience, but to a large extent, of course, has to do also with digital experience. Over. And we are just really almost to conclude. So the point is that this new notion of heritage is not canceling the previous notions. So clearly we have a very strong emphasis of conservation in the traditional sense, and clearly the entertainment dimension of heritage is not something that we can simply ignore. But the point is that there is a much more complex and multifaceted and ambitious agenda that we have to face. This really means that the heritage community that has tended to be very defensive in the past, very, in some sense, skeptical and suspicious of every kind of contamination in terms of, let's say, opening up the discourse in terms of heritage, the mission and social value of heritage institutions today is really put into question radically. This means that there is an enormous possibility for innovation, an enormous possibility for enhancing social impact, but also at the same time, there is an enormous need to step out of the comfort zone. And this is, I think, the challenge for the next generation. And this is where I think it would be extremely important to work on a new synthesis between research in these particular fields and, of course, policy experiments and experiences. I think that's all on my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luigi, for this inspiring presentation, actually, and of this overview of how the notion of heritage evolved. I would like to present now our fourth speaker, Professor Dr. Andy Pratt. He is an internationally acclaimed expert. Sorry, I can't see my other presentation. Yes, sorry. Sorry, Andy. Yes. Okay. Okay. Andy is an internationally acclaimed expert on the topic of the cultural industries. He is a professor of cultural economy at City University of London, and he specializes in the analysis of the cultural industries globally. His research has three strands. The first focuses on the social and economic dynamics of clustering and knowledge exchange. The second strand concerns the definition and measurement of employment in the cultural or creative industries. The third concerns cultural governance and policy making at the national, regional, and urban scales. His current research concerns translocal cultural production chains and is funded by Horizon 2020 project called Cicerone. Andy, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Hopefully you can see the screen there. Okay, let me just make that appropriate. Right. Well, thanks very much. And I'm very happy to both be here virtually and also to share the floor with the three previous presenters. And I think there's been a really useful and helpful set of contributions, which hopefully I can add my coda to as well in this debate. Basically, I guess overall what I want to talk about links together with what has been said already, but I want to just stress this point really, that that culture is dynamic. It's heterogeneous, and changing and developing. And I think, obviously, this has been, this is recognized, but this is sort of partly the point that certainly Pierre Luigi and actually everybody, as Christian and David has pointed out, is that there's a challenge of catch up between governance and policy and the actuality, if you like, of heritage. And of course, this is a sort of implicit contradiction, because somehow we have assumed that heritage is the same as it always was, and is just there in the past. And it's this sort of sense of which that we need to reconceptualize heritage that I want to touch upon here. Also, of course, we've had a lot of new agendas in relation to the cultural field and heritage in specifically speaking here. And this is related to all sorts of wider and legitimate concerns that every policy field has had to respond to. And those are about questions about the environment and sustainability and inclusion, economic development. Previously, of course, this has been the main dimension, but we've had environment added to this, as well as the social rights and social divisions, particularly about indigenous peoples and their expressions, and also a move away from simply the expression on material culture to the immaterial or the intangible expressions. And of course, all of these have been reflected, particularly at UN level, with UNESCO particularly leading many of these issues, and many agreements at the international level being made here. I guess the point here is, can you keep on adding little bits on to an existing model, or maybe you need a new model? And that's I think that's a question that we have to struggle with. And I think this is also related to the way that effective governance of any sort relates to what that governance is seeking to change in what its object is, and this relationship of objects and governance, I think, is something that as academics and those speaking with policy makers need to really consider. Because if the object changes, then it may well be that the governance, the mode of governance, and the materiality of governance in terms of its organization, as well as what the processes of change are, may need to change. And I think that is also part of, to an extent, what both Christian and Pierre Luigi were talking about there, about these regimes of change. And when does a change become a revolution? When is a big change in terms of a change of paradigms in that sense? I think also related to this is the issue of communication. And legitimacy, governance and legitimacy are an important point here. And therefore, actually, the communication of this, I mean, David raised the point about the way that economics has been used as a tool for legitimacy in this way, and the development of particular techniques to convey that and to provide rationales for decision makers in this way. But always there is this tension, and Pierre Luigi mentioned it just now in this issue of the role of the public as well. So I think this question of the communication between practitioners, the public, policy community and politicians, so they understand it, is a particularly critical element at this point in time. I guess to take up those points, I just wanted to bounce off some of the points that have already been mentioned in relation to heritage and debates about the circular economy, for example, which I think are exemplars of attempts to change and adapt in a very positive way. So I think in my terms, the discussion about the circular economy in general is a practical model that extends the object and its domain of impact. So the object if it was a heritage site, suddenly we extend it to think about where the materials for its maintenance and development, questions about whether it should maintain a heritage object, or whether it should be knocked down, or whether it should be reused in some way. And these arguments about the circular economy, it's not really a theory. I think it's more a design process, but it leads to a very important communication tool, and about the visualization of solutions, which in this case have been characterized as the so-called closing of circles. This idea that obviously you try to reuse rather than discard in this way. And as Christian's team and others have been working on this idea, and they've highlighted particularly this issue of adaptation and reuse, and using a sort of circular model that is on the right-hand side of the screen here, about looking at the sourcing of building materials and construction and use and operation, etc. Moving around this whole process, making that visible, and bringing that, drawing that into the area of regulation and policy, and the object of policy that isn't simply about the one object, but it is about the life of that object as well. I think this has been really positive, and we've heard about the way in which this can bring in a new dimension to these debates that we've been having. But I think it is a little bit weak on wider notions of sustainability, because is it simply about reuse, or is it about the ongoing nature? And that's the point that I guess David mentioned right at the beginning there about is it simply heritage? We must simply hang on to it. I think for me, it raises a question which I think obviously is codified in UNESCO's Declaration on Cultural Diversity, etc. It is about the relationship between non-human and human environments, in a sense. So this issue of the immaterial skills, local practices, and the intangible, which are sort of implied by many of these issues about the reproduction of the material environment, but obviously those forms are not its focus. So one could imagine it being extended in this way. It's not inimical to the whole approach. But also, of course, we might add natural environments or cultural environments as well that may not have an obviously material built form, but there may be just a landscape. There may be a place in which is important to a particular community in terms of its sense of identity. So all these sorts of issues, I think, is part of a heritage in that ordinary sense of the word. It's an inheritance that is used and reused in this way, that we need to bring within some form of governance framework. So I think that the point here that I think the lesson that I take from this is that it's more than simply closing circles or linking chains or extending chains, but it's moving from a siloed thinking to ecosystems. So lots of keywords in there, if you like, or lots of buzzwords. But broadly, this point that I was raising earlier is that basically we're in a transition from a more linear style of thinking that admits instead recursive processes, multi-directional processes, and diverse outcomes, rather than a linear directed single objective process. And I think we can elaborate a linear model, or we can move to a more either a circular or a more ecosystem type model. I'm not looking for a direct analog there with ecosystem, but it's the process of the interrelatedness that I'm pointing to here. And critically within this, the object of analysis, we move from the atomistic of the individual thing to the relational object. And that is the object in its context, in its relational context. So that's the bigger object that we're talking about, which implies different sorts of interventions rather than simply solving that saving that particular object, but it might be about a system of interrelationships. It might go wider than particularly one site. It could be a link with many sites. It could be a link with histories and futures as well. I mean, a point that was made earlier that David mentioned, which I think many would concur with in this period, is that we've seen the possibilities of digitization, in a sense, coming to the savior of the live performance, and the recognition that also, as another good side of that, as we're doing today, is reducing our carbon footprints by not moving around the world and flying in planes, etc. Likewise with cultural performances of moving theatre companies or bands around the world, etc., etc. So that call has been made and recognized, and digitizing is fantastic, but I think one of the points we have to bear in mind is that the digitization comes with an environmental cost. And as we've seen, the cost of the cloud, a very cuddly object that appears to be very safe and doesn't do anybody any harm, in fact, has a huge environmental cost. It's not just Bitcoin that consumes huge amounts of energy, but the cloud does as well. And it gets bigger and bigger. And in fact, what we're doing now, streaming services, is part and parcel of this process. I won't go into detail, but I mean, it's clear there is an issue there. There was I've written more about this, but other authors have written about, for example, to compare the transition from the vinyl disc for music delivery to streaming an MP3 file. And the calculation is that, in fact, it uses more energy and resources to send the MP3 file. So the idea that digitization is going to save our planet, I'm afraid, is not so at the moment. So that's an example there in just of the energy usage. But when we add in terms of extending chains, we think about what happens to all of our technologies that we use to view and generate these activities, what happens to the printed circuit boards, where they go for disposal. Where they end up in their recycling. We know that it's not in the place that, well, it's not in our homes. They end up if not in a hole in the ground, they end up at another site in the world in which maybe they do egregious damage to both local environments and people there in terms of the pollution and poisoning that they concern. So extending these chains, understanding the full consequences of what here and now appears to be for culture to walk lightly on this earth, I think is a wake-up call. It requires us to actually understand the wider processes, and that it's not just about auditing outcomes, and it's not just about cybernetics. It's really about a broader system, an interrelated system of the way that culture is produced these days, and the governance of that infrastructure. We need to adapt, as Luigi was just mentioning, to be appropriate to the objects that we're trying to govern. I mean, what we're seeing is this dynamic process of the escaping our control, the spilling over of policy, and also that our existing structures of cultural governance are themselves rooted in the past, heritage, if you like, that were appropriate maybe for governing previous regimes, but at this point in time, they are unfortunately organizational silos that in some cases actually inhibit our possibility of achieving any good governance here. So I guess just a quick point I wanted to make is that if we think of cultural processes here as a broader ecosystem in a sort of circular process, then I think we can see that defining culture as heritage, which I think in culture 1.0, as Luigi was talking about, it sort of existed. Really, now we see that it's only one part of the cycle. The creating, the making, the distributing, the exchanging and exhibiting, we don't really see with heritage because we just have the final object. And then, of course, when we see the author or if we see the performance of a song, we only see the final object. We don't see the hidden processes that go behind the making of culture. And I guess I would want to argue that we need to bring these into the light of day in terms of our view of both policy and regulation, and also in terms of supporting the cultural sector, to recognize that actually culture is a living process, and heritage is simply one moment in that system. And furthermore, bringing the notion of the Brundtland report of bringing the future back to the present, which is what I would argue that report did, is that actually I think we ought to consider that tomorrow's heritage is made today. So culture of today is going to be heritage tomorrow. So if you want to look after heritage, you need to actually look after the cultural making today. In other words, the whole process. So heritage is part of a wider cultural ecosystem. It's one stage in the making and the process, the remaking, and obviously the different domains of culture, whether it be audio-visual, whether they be archiving, whether they be music, etc. That they also have interrelationships as well. So just to bring a conclusion to my brief intervention here is that I think that if we want to bring cultural and environmental sustainability questions together and to bear together and to govern them in any meaningful way, I think we need a bigger object than heritage. We need to extend the chains and processes in space and time to see these wider linkages. Obviously, that's a continuing process. We should include making as well as remaking of a cultural ecosystem. And heritage is also the last stage or an intermediate stage in a circular process that is the start of a new cycle of cultural production as well. And I think if we take on that challenge, we need a reformed scope of governance. We need policies that don't deal with rather yesterday's objects. They need to be a recognition of the objects' tentacles that lead through space and time. Also, the existing silos of governance, which were developed for very good reason, perhaps are past their sell-by date, and in fact we need new forms of governance that cut across the existing silos, that mean new policy formations and new departmental organizations that are able to accurately engage with the new objects that are sought to be regulated. So that's the conclusion of what I've got to say. Hopefully, I think it gels with what other people have been saying, but let's see from the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Andy, for this very broad and inspiring presentation. And indeed, we need to make attention to the hidden system, which we don't recognize normally. Before giving the floor to the audience to ask some questions, since the audience now is aware of what you do, I just would like very quickly to ask some questions to the audience to learn more about what they do, but I actually lost the link. So maybe we start with questions and then I will try to retrieve the link again. I can't see any questions in the chat for the time being. No, I can't see any question in the chat. So maybe I will start by asking some questions. And then if any questions arise in the Q&R or in the chat box, I will ask them. I don't know, Landy, if people from the audience can open their mics and interact with the panelists. Okay, so if you have questions, please write them down in the chat box. Okay, thank you very much. So, okay, no questions for now. I will start with a question to David. So, David, your presentation was very interesting in terms of providing an overview of how heritage economics developed in the last 3 decades, let's say. And you also presented a case study from the UK of how the cultural capital theory was applied. I was wondering if you see any difference in heritage economics from a country system-wise, for example, Europe versus other part of the world's perspective? David, could you please unmute yourself?
There we are. Yeah, yes. Look, that's an interesting question. I don't know that there is any sort of major differences between countries in the way in which they approach heritage or the economics of heritage, because we all share the same sort of problems. It's true that the actual policy issues are different depending on the nature of the circumstances in the various countries, and so, for example, in the UK, as I was talking about, there has been for quite some time a concern within the Department of Culture there about taking the notion of cultural heritage into the broader decision-making of government, with some proper attention to the economics. And that really means, in particular, looking at public values and looking at the ways in which, the non-market values get generated and how important they are in determining public decision-making. And we know that this is always the case in public decision-making in relation to investment in anything, whether it's an airport or a school or whatever. But usually the non-market benefits may be included as a sort of externality in the case of, say, a freeway. Some congestion costs might be added in, or reduction in congestion costs might be added in. But in relation to heritage, it's a larger picture than that, and the values which can't be represented like that really, which are either non-market values or, as we've been talking about, cultural values, need to be sort of taken into the picture, and that's why the cultural capital concept has proved to be quite useful in that particular project. But if we look in other countries, I mean, we see various work being done by economists, like in Italy, for example. There has been a lot of work done on methodologies and particularly contingent valuation. There's been lots of work done there, and the sort of stuff that Luigi does, which is sort of broader ranging thinking about how heritage fits into a much broader picture of society. Those are the sorts of things but they tend to be traceable back to individuals or to individual schools rather than to countries. I think that overall we all share the interest. One of the things which I would say, though, which was quite interesting in the way in which the discussion developed in the 4 panelists in this discussion, is the way in which we have indeed moved from the sort of compartmentalized view of heritage economics that I looked at and could see developing to this much more, to use Andy's term, sort of cultural ecosystem, or to use Pierre Luigi's term, the Heritage 3.0, which is, you know, sort of bringing in much broader notions of interactions, networks, and so on. I think of this particularly in terms of ecosystems, because that's the connection, or that's one of the connections with the sustainability paradigm. And I think we know that in policymaking generally, the notion of sustainability is absolutely sort of paramount now, and we have to sort of take into account. We have to see where we fit, and where does culture fit, where does cultural heritage fit within that. And I think the sorts of contributions that Christian talking about innovation, Andy talking about the circular economy, and Pierre Luigi talking about new ways in which we can interpret heritage. I think these are all the ways in which we're going now, and I don't think that depends on particular countries. I think that's where the sort of that's where the sort of intellectual development is happening, and it's happening at a sort of global level.
Thank you very much, David, for this very important answer, actually, which takes us back to context-based tools developed according to societal needs. I have many different questions for each of the panelists, but I will first give the floor to the audience. So we have a question, and these are open questions for all of you, so I will read them all and then I will open the floor for you to interact. How do the panelists think about labor economics, in particular within their broader frameworks of heritage economics? The second question is from Donovan Ripkma. 4 brilliant presentations. Thank you. Each of you have described how increasingly complex our consideration of heritage has become. My question is, will it become too complex for governance? Will the definition of heritage become so broad as to be meaningless? And the third question is from Andre Garcia. Professor Christian Ost, would you expand your thoughts on what heritage entrepreneurs mean? Is this state of mind part of our current view, zeitgeist of what heritage is, or something that should be developed and in a way taught? So the floor is yours. Please, if anyone feels like to answer these questions. Yes, Andy, please.
Yeah, I'll have a stab at some of it. I mean, I think just to sort of pick up the point here about whether this is too broad, and that has a possibility of undermining the utility of the approaches. I think I would, rather than saying it about being too broad, I would come back to David's point, which is about the way in which particular, in the case that he mentioned, particular economic techniques can be used to translate a problem or an issue across different audiences, different departments of government, shall we say? You know, so to make, to make the Treasury understand a cultural problem, yeah, you have to use their language, and so it's this sharing of language that I think cultural economics and also heritage economics has developed a particular tool, I think, that has enabled some communication. However, I think it's not the only way, and I think there are some intrinsic shortcomings of that economic analysis in terms of not through anyone's particular problem, but the assumptions that it makes, and sometimes about the problem of effectively looking simply at markets and rather than looking at the institutions and the shaping and the structure of those markets, which is, that's an intrinsic problem with neoclassical economics. So you can't blame it for it. That's what it does. But there are these issues that come out with that aren't simply, and this is what David has mentioned about the multiple value systems, or simply the public versus private value systems, which are a way of resolving those problems. So you can either have a dualist approach, or you can say, is there some way we can merge these together? And I think that the circular economy sort of approaches that they offer, or at least some of these debates that we've been talking about, offer a way perhaps of bringing together what we formerly knew as public and private cultural value. But clearly they're not going to be expressed as a number at the end. So that could be the thing that kills them off, because it won't get the Treasury to agree to it. But nevertheless, if we're talking about sustainability, social sustainability, and broader concepts of cultural value, then perhaps we need to start with that as well. So I think we've identified a central dilemma, and there are different approaches to getting round it. But this sense of trying to draw in the broader implications is, I guess, what we're struggling with in different ways, whether we're trying to map those in terms of resources and products that travel around the world and end up being wasted or not recycled, or whether adding prices to those things will be the thing that will cause people to act in the right way. And of course, one of the major ironies of this process is that waste implies that something doesn't have value. But of course, when you create a market in waste, then that itself has a value, and you have a competition in a sense, and maybe an intrinsic problem, disincentive to recycle. So that can be a problem in terms of these different systems getting out of balance. But I think we're condemned to have a broader dimension on this process, and the rather neat idealized view of a textbook version of neoclassical economics is of course what cultural economics has responded to give it some more space. But that's in a sense, that's the space that we're in, and maybe we're pushing it one direction or another in these debates.
Thank you very much, Andy. Does anyone from the panel? Yes, Christian.
Maybe just to give a quick answer to the question from the audience about entrepreneurship. What I define that as a state of mind, because this is in references to the word that Schumpeter is himself, and this word entrepreneurship was not translated the best way, because in German it was Unternehmergeist, which is a spirit, which is entrepreneur spirit. So it's more about the way that some skills that you get, that you can learn in order to go from the creative process, which is related in cultural economics more about the production of things, about craftsmanship, about pieces of art, and to bring that a step further in the market. Now, the market could be misleading, because we know that it's not a question about a profitable market. It's just to bring the supply and the demand together. And that, as David said, cultural economists use a lot of time to define and to identify non-market values, because this is basic what it's about, cultural values. So it's, in a way, it's to bring, you see, these non-market values in something that could be digested in a way or another by your market. And telling that, I must say that I was last week to a symposium, also online, with a colleague of mine that David knows very well, also Arjo Klammer from Erasmus University, and he came with an interesting notion that I can relate it to the question that we have here. He presented the contribution of the artist basically as giving something to the society. You know, he's not asking for something. So basically, the cultural world on the supply side, so the artist brings something to the society, and the society should have a contact or of either an expression of either satisfaction or, you know, a relationship there about that, which is, I think, not too far to what Luigi says as cultural or heritage 3-1. So it's a by-way. It's not just a single one-way, right? But it's an encounter, and it's a meeting between us. And this was interesting because the scheme showed this society and what he called an oikos, which was the domestic ways from an artist to do that for himself and then for the society. And then the market sphere and the government sphere were two additional things, but not central one anymore. And so adding, you see, the ways and the possibility to bring the trade-off, to manage the externalities some way about everything, but that was no more central to the process of creation, distribution of this cultural artifact. And I think, to me, that entrepreneurship, or the skills that we have in entrepreneurs in the business world, could be really useful to provide maybe artists and maybe also conservation specialists, site managers, to make these types of connection, which is going back to an ecosystem in a way where everyone has a share in this process.
Thank you, Kristen. I'm going to read a couple of questions again. A question from Monica is the following. New directions in conservation will benefit from bridging the dichotomy between utilitarian, economic, intangible, spiritual, and ecological values, and from acknowledging the conflicting relationships between societies and their environments. In terms of governance, what are the priority aspects in the conservation underlying infrastructure that should be improved? So this is the question of Monica. And there is a question from Fikri. Real transformation in the form of regenerative capital for cultural heritage will require a constant flow of mainstream investment funds alongside less risk-averse philanthropic and social enterprise funders to stream directly to grassroots community level and regional level activities. Is there a role for mainstream real estate investment funds and trusts to collaborate in cultural heritage projects? And I think Fikri left another comment, which is one of the main issues is how to start fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goals. The first issue is to clarify the notion of community, other than that of the local community. The second is the value that has to be given to education, innovation, and partnerships in conjunction with heritage economic projects as the key to combat poverty and achieve other goals. Yes, so that's it. I think the governance part, yes, David, I can see that you unmuted yourself, and Pierluigi as well.
Well, I've already spoken. Let Luigi say something, but I would like to add something to what I said before. Pierre, Luigi, I think you're anxious to say something.
No, but David, go first. Then I'll follow up.
Okay, well, look, just very quickly, I'd like to respond to Donovan Ripkemer's point. And hi, Don. It's nice to see you on the or hear you on the go. The question that you asked about becoming too broad. I mean, I think heritage remains heritage, and it's there, and will continue to be there. And one of the things that I've actually said about the COVID pandemic is that whatever happens, heritage just continues. It's there, and so there's so much else gets changed, but the heritage assets are still there. And so I think that one of the things that we should take into account is that it's true, as I think it was Andy who said, heritage is constantly being created and passed forward, and it is a dynamic process. There's no question that it continues. Some of the stuff which is created as cultural goods now will become cultural capital in the future, because it will become sort of useful and valuable and retained. Others will just disappear. I mean, this is true of most works of artists, and so, in relation to the stuff that continues, which we call heritage, the same sort of principles will still apply. I think what's happened is, and the things that Andy and Pierre Luigi particularly have drawn attention to, is the broadening of the notion of the stakeholders, of the people who should be brought into the picture in thinking about these things. And that's something that has changed. And in fact, it really goes back to the way I introduced my presentation right at the beginning. It was what Peacock was saying. The heritage in those days was just a very narrow sort of thing, which was the domain of the professionals, and that was all there was to it. And they could do their own stuff, and nobody else had a look in. And so he was saying, well, at least let's let the economists have a look at this. Now we're saying, that the people who have an interest in heritage is much broader, and we have to work out ways of governance which is going to take all of those things into account. And thanks, Don, for that question, because I think that's a really important one. Just very, very quickly in relation to labor economics, because I noticed that one's been there. I don't know that there is much of a connection. I mean, I think when in cultural economics, labor economics really relates to the work of artists and creative workers, and the notions of non-pecuniary income and so on, and the ways in which the activities of those workers differs from those of other people. But I can't see that having a particular relevance in heritage, but perhaps the person who asked the question might have another view about that. Thanks.
I would like to pick Fakri, very interesting question in terms of the societal challenges that are related to the future of heritage. I think that in some sense, one of the real issues has been that heritage has been confined somehow in a very, in some sense, in a golden bubble of irrelevance, so to speak, which means that it's important, of course, we are proud of it and so on and so forth, but it doesn't really matter when it comes to the real challenges. The real challenges are about something else, or for example, in terms of climate change, is more that climate change is threatening, for example, the survival of heritage, but how can heritage help us tackle better, for example, the issues of climate change? So from this point of view, I think that these new issues of emerging issues of social governance and education are fundamental. Culture production is related to behavioral change. This is not a discovery. This is basically how culture emerged in the first place in human history. We have forgotten that, but if we, for example, it surprises me that one of the most striking and profound books on the ethnography of culture production, Homo Aestheticus by Ellen de Sanayak, is basically read by nobody today. And that's an incredible book in terms of really putting the right questions and putting the right concepts in the right places in terms of how, for example, in the fundamental emergence of ritual, for example, which is at the backbone of every human society, culture has an extremely important dimension. And this means that heritage, being the accumulation, being the assets that really, in some sense, transmit from generation to generation this forms of meaning, really can have a tremendous impact on how people behave. So the point is, how can we recover this vision? this idea of heritage communities and this idea of finding new forms of governance and also distributing responsibility for curating heritage is not simply a way of preserving and transmitting heritage. It's a way of creating new forms of agency, because there is an agency in transmitting heritage in terms of what counts for you. What are the things that should be brought to public interest attention or not? So from this point of view, I think that, we have to change the agenda setting, and in particular from the cultural point of view, in parallel, as Ruba mentioned today, there is this ongoing meeting of the G20, in this case of the G20 organization, which for the first time in its G20 history is discussing a cultural agenda. This thing has an enormous implication, because for the first time we have a real perception that culture is not just about a sidetrack that is interesting for an elite group of people who have some illuminated interests and views about those peculiar aspects of human existence, which are however marginal for most people. There is really a way of reconnecting culture to the fundamental issues, and these issues are social impact, first of all. So this means that to legitimize the agenda for the future of heritage, we need to recognize it, especially now in the post-pandemic scenario, to the big challenges. How heritage is not simply being influenced, but influencing climate change. How heritage is influencing our view, for example, our understanding of a circular economy. How heritage is, for example, influencing our mental health. How heritage is influencing global inequalities from the social and educational point of view. These are meaningful questions. They can be asked. And I think that giving the right agency to local communities could really make the premise for a revolution in terms of how heritage enters the policy agenda.
Yes, Andy.
Thanks. I'd just like to add a coda to that point. I mean, I think Luigi is right about, particularly about pushing it down to the new communities of interest in this way, away from and as David pointed out, the rather narrow range of experts. But I think what's a signal that I see coming out from it, a message I see coming out from it, is that we desperately need some re-education of policymakers. Not because they've failed, but actually there's a whole new agenda here. And they haven't been trained in these areas, in all of the areas, or the areas that they need competence over. And if they're to be working across different department portfolios and to convince other parties that they're legitimate in this way, then they will need skills and they will need techniques. David has talked about the way that cultural economics has provided some of those techniques, but I would argue that we have additional problems as well. Some of them are organizational. You just can't get things done in a very restricted government department often, despite the best will in the world. So I think there's this issue about that policymakers need some help. They need help in order to be able to translate their ideas. And I think this is where ideas, very simplistic ideas like the circular economy, can be very powerful, because people get it in terms of what that means. I mean, they may not follow through the detail, but actually the notion of recycling and the fact that there may be consequences of the environment, etc., in that particular case. We can also see those sort of public education ideas are important for building the legitimacy. So that's an important part, so people can have an informed decision. But I do think that we actually, it comes back to, in a sense, the education field and the policy field to redouble our efforts to see whether we have the right tools, whether we're providing the appropriate ways that will enable citizens to make their decisions, for politicians to make their decisions, for accountants to make sure that the audit happens appropriately. It's balancing those things. But I think we have to an extent, been lulled into a period of false security about whether we have the tools of cultural policy. But it's a fast expanding and changing area, which I think needs innovation there as well.
Thank you very much, Andy. And actually, I would like to thank all the panelists for the insightful and brilliant contributions today. You're leaving us with a lot of food for thought and with a lot of inspiration also about not only the past, but future innovation for the future. I have the task of wrapping up the session. I'm not sure. I took lots of notes. Monica, don't worry. I will report at the final session of New Heritage Approaches. But I will really conclude with a very brief note explaining about providing an overview of what we spoke about, but I will be ready for the end of June. We have listened to David Strossby, who opened the session by shedding light on the main milestones in the development of heritage economics since the 80s. He also provided insights about the future and reflected on how the practices today are being actually shaped by the context needs. Christian Ost investigated the value chain of all activities, and he explained why there is need for innovation, what's the role of policy, what is actually the heritage value chain, and the fact that we need cultural entrepreneurs with impact and there's need for upskilling. Pierre Sacco presented a conceptual canvas that allows to explore a series of different functionings of heritage and to assess the critical conditions for the various cultural production regimes. But he also helped us understand the challenges of mapping, filtering, indexing, metabolizing, and entitling, while there's an urgent need for legitimizing, adapting, and empowering. He also introduced broadly the concept of open community of practice and how the concept of participation and engagement is very challenging, but very relevant and important today. Finally, Andy Pratt investigated the cultural and creative ecosystem and the circular economy and explored commonalities and differences, as well as what can we learn from this cyclical thinking. Very importantly also, Andy provided a definition of what culture is. He put emphasis on the importance of adopting new agendas or amending the existing ones, work on the challenges of effective governance and the need of re-educating policymakers, upskilling at all levels. So I would like to thank you all again. A big thank you to all our panelists, but also to our great audience and to the brilliant questions which you posted in the chat. I would like also to remind you that next Friday we have a second session on heritage economics, evidence-based practices. So we will provide case studies from research projects from around the world. Please join us and we look forward to seeing you all soon again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruba. Thank you to all of you to this excellent session. And we are inviting you to the other sessions and the final session with Ruba and Christian again. So thank you very much. And thank you, Ruba and Christian, for coordinating the session.